Good evening, everybody. We are just gonna wait a minute or two while folks pop in to the webinar and join us live. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And those of you who are coming into the webinar and just joining us, I would love you to take a minute to put in the chat, just introduce yourself, and we would love to know where you are listening from this evening. So if you want to just pop in and introduce yourself in the chat and where you're coming in from tonight, that would be great. And in just about a minute, we are going to get started. All right, we've got people popping in anywhere from New York City to Trenton, New Jersey, to West Gardner, to Dominica. This is going to be exciting. Amber, you have global fans. DC, this is terrific. New Hampshire? Oh, I'm loving this already. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Libby Bischoff. I have the great pleasure of being the executive director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine in Portland, Maine. And we are absolutely delighted this chilly February evening in May to be welcoming all of you to the kickoff to our Founding Memories lecture series. So we have a current gallery exhibit in the Osher Map Library, and it is called Founding Memories, America at 250. And it's our contribution to thinking about all of the complexities of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of 1776. And so it really looks at the way in which the symbols of the revolution and the memory of the Revolutionary War plays out in the ways in which people choose to represent the revolution over time, from maps that are created right at the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to the centennial, to the bicentennial, and asking really folks who visit us to think about what is America at 250. For those of you who can't join us in person before it closes in mid-June, Founding Memories, we also have a digital version of the exhibit, which will happily pop in the chat for you in just a few minutes so you can see it from afar. But if you can come see us, we would love to host you. We're open Tuesdays through Fridays, 10 to 4, and most Saturdays, 10 to 2. So our website is oshermaps.org. Kelsey will put all of that in the chat, and so you can come on by and see the show. I also really wanted to thank our sponsors for this lecture series. We were lucky enough to receive a grant from the Maine Semi-Quincentennial Commission with funding provided by the Maine State Archives and the Maine State Cultural Affairs Council to sponsor this whole series. So we could not be more excited to have Dr. Amber Wiley as our first speaker and first guest. So I'm going to introduce Amber, and then I'm going to turn the program over to her. We are going to listen as she talks about a Black Power bicentennial, and then we will have some time for a Q&A at the end. If that sounds good, then we will get started. Amber Wiley is the Wick Carey Director of the Institute for Quality Communities at the University of Oklahoma, where she is in Oklahoma this evening with us. It's still sunny there. She has over 20 years of experience in historic preservation, architecture, and community engagement. And through her teaching, research, and professional practice, she advances the history and narrative of design and preservation in Black communities. Her first book, entitled Model Schools in the Model City, is a finalist for the 2026 Association for the Study of African American Life and History Book Prize. We'll stay tuned to see how that goes. That's very exciting. And her second book, Collective Yearning, is set for publication in May of 2026. Amber has been busy writing and publishing. She received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University and holds an MA in Architectural History and Historic Preservation from the University of Virginia School of Architecture and a BA in Architecture from Yale University. And I encountered Amber's work when I had a wonderful NEH fellowship um, down in DC and got to learn a little bit about the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation and their work leading into 1976 and the bicentennial as really a deep activism for representation, right? And who gets to be part of the story, who gets featured in the narrative of America's history, who gets to write these narratives, who gets to be represented. And this is something we've really been thinking about with our exhibit and putting it together. And so I really could not think of anyone I wanted to listen to more, to be honest, tell these stories. So Amber, welcome virtually to Maine. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Libby. Yes, here we go. It's fantastic to be able to be with you all, albeit virtually. Thank you also, Kelsey, and for Zach, for helping set up all this technology, getting the publicity out, and all of those fun things. Please do let me know if you can see this screen well. Is there anything blocking it, or are we good?
You look good.
Fantastic. So yes, want to talk a bit about the idea of revolutionary dreams and the work that was done in the 1970s to create a Black Power bicentennial. I'll talk a bit about this image later. So initially, I had the word agenda up here, but I think it's better to call it an itinerary because we are going to three different places. We will start in New Jersey, which the National Park Service calls, and I don't know who originated this particular term, the crossroads of the American Revolution, because so many battles were fought in New Jersey. We'll head on down to Washington, D.C., where there isn't actually an official slogan for DC for 250. So I'm just calling it an Afro-American Bicentennial. And then we will skip right on up to Philadelphia, where their slogan for 250 is "Start Here." America did. um, and it's funny to think about Washington because Washington as an entity, as a district, didn't exist during the American Revolution, right? Washington grew out of an act of Congress in the 1791, was actually occupied as the nation's capital starting in 1800. So it's kind of funny to even think about Washington in terms of the American Revolution. What we have here on the screen is also a cover image from an Ebony magazine um, issue that is talking about the bicentennial 1975. I think this issue came out, and whether or not Black people should participate. It's also heralding 200 years of Black trials and Black triumphs. So think about how many folks you can name as you're looking at that image. So yes, this will be a tale of three cities. On the left, you have a view into New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is where I used to reside. I actually reside in North Brunswick, but New Brunswick is where Rutgers University is, and I had the pleasure of teaching there for several years. It is the site of an old Revolutionary era tavern that we will be talking about. Now it is um, an on ramp or actually an off ramp for a highway. But this particular view we are looking at on the left hand side at the Hyatt Regency and Johnson and Johnson is where a Revolutionary War tavern once existed, and we'll hear a little bit about that. In the middle, we have Robert DeForest, who is proclaiming the establishment of the Afro-American Bicentennial. This is in the 1970s. His brother Vincent DeForest is beside him. They were the founders of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, and they're actually in front of the Frederick Douglass House in Washington, D.C. that was under repair during that time. To the far right, we have one of my students from the University of Pennsylvania who is showing her research project for a class that I taught called Revolutionary Approaches to Philadelphia's Black Heritage. And she was looking specifically at urban gardens in South Philly and the work that urban garden clubs were doing in the city to combat the notion of the need for urban renewal in the 50s and 60s. So let us start in New Jersey, crossroads of the American Revolution. I first started thinking about the revolution when I was teaching a class about historic preservation theory and practice. And I wanted to take my students on a site visit. And so we went to the closest historic open air museum village, which was in Piscataway. And at the time, it was called East Jersey Old Town Village. And they had the extra E on there for quite some time. They've recently rebranded and taken off the extra E from old and town. But, they definitely put forth that ye old village of yesteryear um, facade up. What we're looking at directly in front of us is the Indian Queen Tavern, which is the jewel, the crown jewel of this open air museum. And my students and I actually visited this the week before everything shut down during COVID. It's March 2020, if that's right. Yeah, when we visited. That was the last time I saw the students in that class in person. But the students walked around the site. They had an assignment in which they would write a response to their experience on the site. I'll talk a little bit about it. It was an amalgamation of different buildings, historic buildings that were renovated and rehabilitated, as well as new construction and reconstruction of historic buildings. And it's a town that never existed in real life. It was created to give you an idea of what life in colonial East Jersey felt like, but it's a complete um, figment of one's imagination in the sense that these buildings never sat in relationship to each other on this site before. So students had to grapple with that. I think it's wild. I love it though. I absolutely love it, but I also think it's wild. So when I took my students to that museum, they wanted to know, why is it called East Jersey Old Town Village? And I said, that's a fantastic question. I did not know the answer. The term East Jersey comes from a colonial era division of the land of New Jersey into eastern provinces and a western province. And you will note, since we are at a lecture related to a map library, that north is to the right. So I love this particular image. This was one of the ones that we advertised the talk with. Pennsylvania's up here, okay? New York's over here. East Jersey's on the bottom, West Jersey's on the top. What you might understand as East Jersey today, we might call North Jersey, and West Jersey is South, except that when I was in New Jersey, I lived in what was considered Central Jersey. I am not from New Jersey. There are people on here who might be combative about that term, but I was a part of an organization that was the Central New Jersey chapter. I lived in Middlesex County, and it's even the ways that we think about these spaces is really quite fascinating. But that particular village was a recreation of what people thought East Jersey looked like in the colonial era. So here you have another view with Indian Queen Tavern and some of the other buildings that were taken from around Middlesex County and some other counties in New Jersey that were still part of East Jersey. again, some were recreations and some were heavily renovated. This is a one bedroom, not one bedroom, a one room schoolhouse. There was a completely reconstructed Dutch Reformed church. And it was a fun site to visit, but you definitely got a little bit confused as to what was happening when you were told, but these things were never in the same place at the same time until now. So the building that we know as the Indian Queen Tavern had a very long history, and it spent almost 200 years in a place right there in New Brunswick. So that image that I showed you all before, looking towards the Hyatt Regency in Johnson and Johnson. This is a similar view, but just a little bit closer. This building here is what would become the crown jewel of East Jersey Old Town Village. At the time, though, it was called the Bell Hotel, and it sat on Albany Street in New Brunswick. So here's another image of the Bell Hotel, Indian Queen Tavern, Bell Hotel, um, a lot of other names that I'll share with you a little bit later. One of the first things you can notice is the difference in height. This structure has 3 stories, while our Indian Queen Tavern has 2. So I was confused when people told me it was the same building because that alone threw me off. I did research on this particular structure in East Jersey Old Town Village after that class as a part of Monument Lab's artist residency called Revolution NJ. Monument Lab, based in Philadelphia, PA, had gotten a grant to work with the New Jersey Historic Trust and a couple of other folks to think about how to tell the story of the American Revolution in 2026, right? Keep in mind that the research I was doing was 2020, 2021. So we were still many years out. And I said, okay, if I could pick a site in New Jersey that I want to investigate, it's going to be this East Jersey Old Town Village place that is crazy to me, and the Indian Queen Tavern. And I soon discovered the original location of the structure, like I said, in the city of New Brunswick, not in Piscataway. And most of the renderings that I found of it were similar to this one here, where you see this tavern, this hotel in the midst of a highly industrialized landscape, a working canal, along the Raritan River. And I said, this is nothing like the way it's presented today. And I was fascinated. So I continued the research. This is a bird's eye view of New Brunswick. You can see the tavern right here. Again, a working canal, heavy industry. This bird's eye view is from 1910. The Rutgers University is up this way. And I just kept being fascinated with this notion of the Industrial Revolution as opposed to the American Revolution, and how the Indian Queen Tavern had spent most of its life in an urban setting and not that bucolic setting it's in now. And I should also say the Indian Queen Tavern is where George Washington, let me get this, I don't know, did he sleep there? I'm not sure. Benjamin Franklin slept there. There was some sort of American Revolution between New York and Philadelphia. New Brunswick is the hub of the area. So if you're riding by horse in buggy between Philly and New York, then you would probably stay the night in New Brunswick, right? And so the story was that, during American Revolution time, some of our great forefathers stayed the night in New Brunswick and stayed at the Indian Queen Tavern. So that was the American Revolution connection there. But they were in New Brunswick. They weren't in Piscataway, which is further north out this way. And so the more I looked into the history of this site, I wanted to find the origin of the building. The earliest that I could find was a 1729 reference to it in a map that it was a private residence. because of its location right there on the river. And before a bridge was made, it was a place that people would ferry back and forth. It had the name Hoot's Corner. In the 1770s, it was Drake's Tavern, also called Indian Queen Tavern, which is the name that East Jersey Old Village uses. It was Bell Tavern in the 1818s, then Bell Hotel. And then for 60, almost 60 years, it was the Parkway Hotel, or also called Andy's Tavern and Andy's Hotel. And I was just like, the Indian Queen Tavern isn't even the longest that the building, was known as. Like it's just one episode in a much longer, fascinating history of this site. And so, as I was doing the research for Monument Lab, I found the historic photographs. You can see here, this is the background. The tavern is in the background here. You can barely see it. 1961. I'm talking heavy industry, rubber production. You've got Johnson and Johnson when they were producing all sorts of like gauzes and cotton, like all sorts of things. It was just so it was fascinating to me um, that this particular building spent so much of its life in an urban setting and is being presented to us as this one moment. Something else that was quite fascinating was the demise of the structure. The reason East Jersey Old Town Village was even created was because one particular man who was a retired medical doctor who had taught at Rutgers wanted to help save buildings that were being threatened with demolition through urban renewal and highway construction. The Indian Queen slash Bell Hotel slash, Hood's Corner building was one of those. The highway construction was a result of Johnson and Johnson keeping their headquarters in New Brunswick. They said, we want to move elsewhere. And because all of the people who work at Johnson and Johnson are moving elsewhere, and the only way you can keep us is if you extend 91 through New Brunswick so that all our commuter executives can come into the city easily. In order to extend Highway 91, of course, you're cutting right along what was the canal that got filled in. And so you would see that our little friend Bell Hotel here, the Roadway Hotel, was in danger. And so Dr. Kler, Kler is his name, helped finance the moving of the structure into what we know as East Jersey Old Town Village. So even thinking about just the pull of Johnson and Johnson to get the highway constructed so that their execs can commute into the city after so many of the heavy industry had left, um, and making it the reason that East Jersey Old Town Village exists. And I will let you all know that East Jersey Old Town Village was dedicated and was a project of the bicentennial. And I said, uh, thinking about how we really fabricate spaces and places to tell a particular story, the East Jersey Old Town Village was dedicated in the mid 70s and was absolutely something that Central Jersey, East Jersey, held up high as a place for people to come visit during the bicentennial. So I didn't know that when I first started the research, but it really broadened my understanding of how we tell history and how we used to tell history and the things we would do to make a pretty picture, so to speak. So when you're looking here, you can think about the fact that you could have possibly been seeing the Bell Hotel there as well. Taking that knowledge with me, I had a bit of an interest, but I really wasn't that interested in the American Revolution, if we're being completely frank. I'm primarily a 20th century scholar, but I was doing a consultation job in Washington, D.C., specifically to update the National Historic Landmark nomination for the Carter G. Woodson House, which is just honor upon honors, right? It's one of those jobs I couldn't believe I got, and I was a co-PI for that update with a friend, Dr. Maria McCurder in Washington D.C. And so the Carter G. Woodson House was undergoing reconstruction. renovation. This is the house here, the red brick house. And then the yellow over here are two other townhomes that the National Park Service purchased in order to create an interpretive museum, while Carter G. Woodson's own home would act as a historic, more traditional historic house museum. But there would be a museum, the offices of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, rotating exhibits, a library, and then you can go into the building itself and see the building as Woodson would have known it. And so part of my job was to update the architectural description of the site and to add to the previous nomination that was only a few pages long and had been written in the 70s. Mhm. So, pulling together a lot of the 50 some odd years of research about Carter G. Woodson's life, his impact, his enduring impact. We're living through his enduring impact right now as we celebrate Black History Month. And so that was part of the work in bridging the gap between the 1970s record and the 20 teens record. Um, One of the fascinating things I found about Woodson, and it's another project I want to do one day, is how he appreciated preservation. The preservation movement, the idea that we should go to historic sites. So part of his job, as he saw it, was to spread knowledge of Black history throughout the world. And that included creating content that was of an academic and scholarly level, but also content that was readily accessible for anybody K through 12. Another thing that was important to him is that the places and spaces where Black history happened were preserved and that people made pilgrimages to these sites. So he's writing in the Journal of Negro History, reflecting on the successes of what was then Negro History Week in 1937. And he's talking about how there were many more pilgrimages to monuments as a part of Negro History Week celebration in 1937. And he names places like the birthplace of George Washington Carver or the Harriet Tubman home. And he says these are monuments not the least imposing, but great because they are enshrined in the hearts of the descendants of those generations that these heroes served. And as you can see, the article where I got this quote is the 12th year of Negro History Week, right? While we're currently celebrating 100 years of Black history through Asala. And there's not a lot of scholarship about the relationship of Black folks to historic preservation in the United States. And I love that I was able to source some information about how Carter G. Woodson thought about historic sites and their use and how they were supposed to perpetuate particular values, but also be places where we can pay homage to our ancestors. And also thinking about visiting sites as a part of Black History Month. As I'm doing the research on the Carter G. Woodson home, I discovered that the original folks who nominated the Woodson home was an organization called the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. And then my head explodes, right? Because I'm like, I was just doing this research in New Jersey, and the bicentennial is connected to this historic house museum, open air village. And now I'm over here working on the Carter G. Woodson House, and I discover that there's an organization that was specifically dedicated to uplifting and enshrining Black historic sites across the US. And I was like, what in the world? What is happening in the 70s? And so you see in the top left the logo for the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, abbreviated to ABC. And like I said, this is an image of Robert DeForest dedicating or really announcing the establishment of this corporation. There were two brothers from the state of Ohio who had been separated. They were brought up in the foster care system, Robert and Vincent DeForest, but they had both made their way to Washington, D.C. And Vincent is still with us, and he's a wonderful, amazing mentor. And one of the things that he says is that history for him was so important because he felt such a lack growing up, not really knowing your roots, being, sent through different homes, living with different families. And so part of his desire to learn more Black history was also part of his desire to learn more about himself. And so that's one of the many impetus for the creation of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. So there was a lot of talk about what the bicentennial would look like when Robert and Vincent, created the ABC in 1970s. And they were constantly pushing all of the official venues to tell the full story. And they framed their approach to the bicentennial as a continuing revolution. And it's taken me some while to really a while to really digest this notion that the revolution didn't stop in the 1790s, that the revolution continues. The revolution was continuing in the 1970s. Um, and so one of the quotes that I got from Vincent, that he's testifying before Congress to talk about the importance of Black history as a part of the larger bicentennial celebration commemoration. What is this continuing revolution we seek to promote in America? We believe it is an ongoing process of decolonization. We believe it is a movement towards self realization and self government by people determined not to be kept in subject status. And so the language that he's using here is some of the same language that we're using in the 2000s, in the 20 teens and 2020s, decolonization. People are like, I just discovered this or I created. No, you didn't. We are really, I think, in some ways ignorant to what our forefathers did in the 70s and 80s. I will say I am myself. And, again, coming across this kind of testimony just was really heartening, but it also made me sad because I was like, well, what happened? What happened to that continuing revolution? Like, what happened in the 80s? What were we doing? Um, but it's still quite empowering to think about this notion, which is why I revisit the work that ABC did and use it as a guide for myself, like even today, like how do I mirror my practice from like what ABC was doing in the 70s. At the time, ABC had a really robust idea of how to commemorate Black history. It included television, it included sports exhibitions, it included writing histories and doing research and reports. But there was one particular area where they were extremely strong and effective, and that was nominating Black historic sites with the National Park Service. Since they were already located in DC, they had a kind of a quick, fast, and easy access to the National Park Service. They were also, again, I'm like a key Asala, involved with Asala and were able to make connections with scholars and politicians, tapping the Congressional Black Caucus to help speak on behalf of their organization to get contracts to do the work that the National Park Service needed to do to recognize Black historic sites. Before 1970, there were 4 sites specifically dedicated to Black history that were a part of the National Park Service, either National Historic Landmark Program or deemed a National Historic Site. To be sure, the National Historic Landmark Program was still new from 1966, but there were only 4 sites that had any kind of particular status related to specific Black history in the Park Service. That was the George Washington Carver site, the Booker T. Washington Boyhood site, Frederick Douglass House, and Tuskegee Institute. They said there's more. There could be more. And so, what the ABC did was enter into a contract with the Park Service, and they hosted a symposium on Black history and the relationship of Black history with the National Park Service that was held in Washington, D.C. This particular material I was able to access through the DC Public Library. So this is part of what I was doing when I was at Dumbarton Oaks, right? At Dumbarton Oaks, loving it, and getting to be in the DC archives and look and see about the work that the DeForest brothers did They did surveys of historic sites across the United States, as well as historic sites within the District of Columbia that they thought should qualify as National Historic Landmarks or be nominated as National Register of Historic Places. And they kept promoting their message. And so here's a Park Service newsletter that talks about the Black Power Bicentennial, and this is a cartoon that depicts a new Mount Rushmore with Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Frederick Douglass, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Martin Luther King. I have to say, as a Black woman, I'm like, where are all the ladies? Like, I'm still looking, but Mary McLeod Bethune is here, so I'm happy for that. But they really made a difference because the Park Service was not equipped to do that kind of research. And like I said, they tapped in a lot of Black historians and scholars, librarians, politicians to move their cause forward. And so, over the course of the next few years, through the surveys they did, they nominated over, now I know the count's actually updated, over 70 sites with the National Park Service, creating 56 National Historic Landmark nominations, seven of which are now historic sites, and doing two National Register Historic Preservation District nominations. In the past, I have done research on these sites to figure out what is a National Historic Landmark, what was elevated to National Historic Site status. Uh-oh, what's going on here? Oh, there we go. Um, and I'm interested in the geography of this. There were two sites in Oklahoma, which is where I am now. Boley, Oklahoma, the National Historic District for that. Something keeps popping up. Is this happening for you all, or is it just me?
No, we can see it too.
Hmm. I'm going to stop my share. Bloop, and then I'm going to start it again. Let's see. I have two PowerPoints open at the same time. I don't know why, but I'm going to go to this one. Okay, cool. We're going to move forward. Some of the sites that the Park Service still presents today when they're talking about Black history are the exact sites that the ABC nominated in the 70s. Okay, the largest number of Black historic landmarks, national historic landmarks, as recognized by the National Park Service, the largest number were nominated in the 70s. So you have Mother Bethel AME in Philadelphia, the Martin Luther King Boyhood House, Harriet Tubman House in upstate New York and Auburn, New York was a very long, and I'm going left to right, top to bottom. Harriet Tubman House was a long, long, long process. After the bicentennial, I'll say ABC rebranded as the Afro-American Institute for Historic Preservation and Community Development, where they continued their work into the 90s. Villa Lawaro, Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site, the Mary McLeod Bethune. I mean, all the sites that the Park Service, most of the sites that the Park Service promotes during Black History Month were sites that the ABC was able to nominate in the 70s. Um, the work they did in Washington, D.C. was astounding. Remember how I said D.C. wasn't even an actual entity during the Revolution? Well, I did some mapping of historic Black neighborhoods in the District of Columbia. Right here, we see a 1950 demographic representation where you'll see Black families primarily located truly in the heart of the district, an area known as Shaw, U Street, Howard University is right over here. Then in Northeast Washington, D.C., some in Southeast, or Southwest actually, and a few further in Southeast. So we've got these pockets of Black enclaves, purposefully, racial covenants, public housing, restricted, segregated housing, all of that stuff. And then I did a lot of thinking about what changed between 1950 and 1970, right? By 1970, DC was fully chocolate city. It was 70% Black. 1950s. 1952 actually is when the city became majority Black, but by the 70s, it was 70 some odd percent Black. And so thinking about the ways that Black history was being told in the nation's capital ahead of the bicentennial is something that's really, really rich to look into. I've done a lot of work in this neighborhood called Shaw, which you see outlined here in purple. And so I was trying to see what the relationship between the Shaw neighborhood, which is some place that I had researched previously, was to the different sites that ABC was able to get recognized as either National Historic Landmarks or, created surveys on that got them nominated as sites in the National Register of Historic Places. And there is a high concentration here in Shaw, which again is part of that historic heart of Black DC. And so I did a lot of mapping about the impact of ABC in DC and thinking about all of the people in the places that they had highlighted. So that includes residences, businesses, churches, offices, headquarters of various folks. I've presented this image as a collage before, and I asked people to think about who in these pictures can they name. Perhaps y'all can put some things in the chat. Who do you see here in these images? Frederick Douglass. Don't be shy. Charles Drew. Smack dab in the middle. It is hard. It's hard actually. Some of these names you might know. Yes. Yep. They were able to connect people to a specific time and place through the research they did and have an official record. Yeah. I'm looking for the Benjamin Banneker. Where is it? So this was like a reproduction of a photograph, not a photograph, Lord have mercy, a reproduction of a print of something. People kept going back and forth about whether or not that was really him, but I've like tried to find any representation of him that I could find. And that's not Chat GPT, but I'm not gonna say it's like 100% accurate. Okay. Yeah, but one thing you might notice about these folks, all these people weren't alive during the American Revolution. So, what is it like? What was the approach that ABC took to have these folks commemorated under the banner of the bicentennial? They didn't stick with the 1770s to 1800 narrative. They said this is 200 years of history. And that's still a question that we're grappling with today. Are you only, commemorating something that happened in the 1790s, 1780s, all the way up to 1800, or are you commemorating 250 years of history? Depending on how you set that frame, you might be telling a very different story. And they were determined to push the 250, I mean, at the time, 200-year history and Black contribution over the course of 200 years, not just over the course of 20 years. I'll say that the work that they did in Washington, D.C., literally created the framework for the contemporary historic districts, the local historic districts that are in the city, the local designations for historic sites. Like there's so much of the work of ABC that I see whenever I look at current historic district maps and things like that. Like folks are building on that work they did. And it's really amazing. And so when you look and see what folks were doing in the district, the official record in the district, it's completely different from the narrative that ABC is enshrining and the stories they're trying to tell. So here is a map that was co-sponsored by the DC's Bicentennial Organization, the official American Bicentennial Revolution Association, as well as public transit in the city. And they were trying to show folks what buses and newly minted metro stops to take to get to certain historic places. And one of the things that I'm always fascinated about is that, 1968 happened, the uprising after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And this map says riot corridors are unchanged. Basically, they're trying to tell people that this is just in ruins. So you probably don't even need to go there. Well, those riot corridors correspond to some of the same corridors that are a part of the Shaw neighborhood. And so I found it fascinating that even in the 70s, when, you could be thinking about 200 years of history, that the official channels were making sure that people got to the National Mall. They might pop over to Alexandria, maybe you'll go to Georgetown. They did make a nod to LeDroit Park, where you see Howard University, nice old houses, Howard Theater, new hospital, a bakery. Okay, nice bread smells. That's what they said. And when it comes to the Shaw neighborhood, it's empty. And so we've got these riot corridors here, where there's not much to see as opposed to downtown, where there's just so much going on. Um, and so when I overlaid the official delimitations of the Shaw neighborhood on this bicentennial map, I mean, it's empty. It's empty, right? And this is exactly the kind of narrative that the ABC was trying to push against. Um, and it shows the necessity for the work that the ABC was doing. And like I said, their impact continues today. I'm gonna I'm gonna like run us through Philadelphia, which is probably maybe the thing that you all want to talk about even the most. But while I was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, I was leading a research and outreach center, and then I taught a class. I didn't teach regularly, but I was able to offer seminars. And as a new resident of Philadelphia, I wanted to learn as much about the city as possible. And so the seminar that I offered was one about thinking about the bicentennial and how we can tell the story of Philadelphia using the same kind of approaches that the ABC did in the 70s. And so I called the class Revolutionary Approaches to Philadelphia's Black Heritage. I did not know what we would find because I'm not a Philadelphia expert. What you see here is a map that was created by W.E.B. Du Bois in the late 19th century when he was writing the book, The Philadelphia Negro. And it's of the historic Seventh Ward neighborhood. It is, a sociological map that talks about social class and things of that nature. But it was certainly a blueprint and something that we continuously referenced in the class. So, one of the readings that I had my students read was a piece by Walter Hood that talked about Black landscapes and whether or not Black landscapes mattered. And I found inspiration in the question that he posed about whether or not pedagogy can extend from the academic context into the world to remind us of the collective voices that truly comprise America's cultural landscape. And I really hope this class would do that. One of the reasons that I proposed that particular seminar is that I had been working with Brent Leggs from the National Trust and local community members from across Philadelphia. I see my friend Bill Adair here, Christopher Rogers from the Henry Ossawa Tanner, Friends of Henry Tanner House, Vashti Du Bois from the Colored Girls Museum, the Black Docents Collective, just a lot of good folks in the room who were thinking, and this is about 2023, who were thinking about the impeding um, 250 anniversary, the semi-quincentennial, and whether or not their sites, their stories would be told as Philadelphia has, fully branded itself as a place where America started. Resources were slim. in the city, they were slim in the state, and the state wanted to make sure that all the resources for Pennsylvania did not focus only on Philadelphia. They wanted the whole state to be able to partake in whatever allocations they had. And so, I will say one of the primary concerns was getting ready for this year, 2026. Philadelphia was actually way behind. It was further behind than you might think. And the lack of financial resources was a real issue. I'm also seeing Victoria Best here. It's just a lot of good people who I have the pleasure of knowing. So the class was an experiment. And I said, we're going to look and like whatever we find, we will share. One, these are the images I use. I love to include Paul Robeson in the discussion because, he actually passed the bicentennial year. And it's like we're starting. If we want to start with a framework, let's start with like Paul Robeson as a framework. He wasn't from Philadelphia. He was from New Jersey. Went to Rutgers, but he lived the last years of his life in Philadelphia and passed away in his sister's home in West Philly. We were doing mapping. We were thinking about new ways to tell stories. So the picture here is actually from the Philadelphia airport, and it's an installation from the Colored Girls Museum. Philadelphia Airport has fantastic public art, and obviously Afro-American Bicentennial, my inspiration. These are the things that I was thinking about when forming the class. And so, again, having the class as a tool to get an understanding of Philadelphia's Black history from colonial era to present was a major goal. Think critically about the way that Philly's Black heritage had been documented up to that time, what the methods were, the strengths and deficits. And I mean, that was also like the larger Philadelphia preservation community. What were some of the strengths and deficits there? Um, Engage in critical discourse about the preservation field and its relationship to underrepresented and under-resourced communities. How do we make sure these stories are told when folks are, they're not getting paid to do their work? A lot of folks are volunteer. Um, People might be retired. This is the only thing they do. And also how to create historic context statements and significant statements that can propel new narratives around the history that my students are creating. And have a proposal. Basically, their final project was to propose, their final assignment was to propose a project like you were pitching a project for funding. So I want to do the history of this particular Black cultural aspect of Philadelphia. And I want to create a festival, or I want to renovate a building, or I want to create a walking tour. And this is the history, so on and so forth. So we started just reading the Declaration of Independence, as it turns out, very first day. Very first day. They're like, oh, we're reading on the first day. Yes. Um, and we also read Frederick Douglass, What to the Slave is the Fourth of July. And happily we're able to actually use James Earl Jones's version as part of a sonic inspiration as well. We talked about the ways in which the revolution had been celebrated in 1976, and that included a visit to the Philadelphia African American Museum, which was dedicated in the bicentennial year. Um, Guided tours offered by the Black Docents Collective of Philadelphia. We went to the archives at Penn and the Fisher Library and thought about the ways in which maps can be methods of research, not just ways that maps depict things that you already know, right? And the relationships of historic maps and their implications on the current um, status of buildings in Philadelphia. My students learned how to use Social Explorer to graphically depict the spaces and places where Black people lived in Philadelphia over the course of time. So these are census data tracts. showing the population of Black Philly from 1940 till about 20, I think it was 2020. And so, where did Black history happen in Philadelphia, right? It's like that was one of the questions that we asked, so we can have a better understanding of what we're even talking about. Um, I'll let that run through again. We also mapped where national and local landmarks were currently located and tried to put that in relationship to historic Philadelphia demographic mapping and contemporary. We went on walking tours for public art projects to think about ways to tell stories in new and innovative, creative, artistic media. We visited some of the very rich Black archives in the city. So, this is the Charles Blockson collection at Temple University. And this is one of William Still's, an early print of William Still's book where he's, writing about people who have escaped from slavery, enslavement. And here you can see Henry Box Brown as one of the folks that he's written about. And I can say I did have a diverse student body in this class, which was really great for our conversations. We talked about West Philly and Penn's relationship to the demolition of Black communities, um, tapping into our colleagues in archaeology who actually let us sort through materials they found in the archaeological site from an urban renewal demolition. Fascinating. And, the students then went and did their own individual research projects related to their own interests. So we had a landscape architecture student who was looking at urban gardens. Like I said, we had a student who was interested in early Black chefs and caterers and their political clout. They actually did hold a good amount of political clout in the 1800s and late 1700s. The places where they worked, none of them still existed. And so they're like, how do I tell this story if the building isn't there? Um, Guide to the Green Book in Philadelphia. And so I had a student who wanted to create, her proposal was a kind of Black Chamber of Commerce, really walking tour, Black business, legacy business initiative. Um, yeah, and just thinking about Black landscapes, how you tell those stories was really important. And so, another quote from Walter Hood, something that we read, is Black landscapes matter because they are renewable, which I found fascinating. Um, he understands the notion that we can uncover, exhume, validate, and celebrate landscapes through new narratives and stories that choose to return us to origins. The contested and the forgotten landscapes, renewed through a myriad of expressions, can give us incentives to obligations for years to come. And so I feel like the work my students did was really in that vein. Here you have an invitation I sent out to people all across Philadelphia to attend my students' final presentations and their pitches. So here's Thomas Dorsey, who was an early Black caterer. One student did his research specifically on the Pyramid Club, which was a social club for Black men, but there was a lot of Black artists who were able to be exhibited at the Pyramid Club. And so he wanted to redo a night at the Pyramid Club, which just, I was like, I would go to that. The Royal Theater. So one of my students did Black musical venues and wanted to propose the development of a musical to celebrate the story of Black folks migrating to Philadelphia and producing really the Philadelphia sound. And again, here's the Garden Club. I mean, they were great, amazing presentations. And so you can see in the room, we had our students and folks joining us in person. We also had a good amount of people on Zoom. So it was like 30 some odd people who listened to my student presentations. And part of them came from Philly 250. I was like, can we actually get these projects done? um, People from the Historic Preservation Commission. I had folks from City Council. I tapped all the people. I was like, the mayor's invited. You want to come? You can come. My students were absolutely terrified, but they delivered really good ideas. We have come to the part where I pause, but this is the story of some things were kind of happenstance. The New Jersey, East Jersey, Old Town Village Bicentennial Connection, doing the work with the Carter G. Woodson House and discovering the tremendous impact that the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation had on what we understand as Black historic sites today, and then trying to find a way to talk about what happened in the 70s and inspire my students to get things kicked off in Philadelphia, where I can say a lot of Black folks still feel like their stories aren't being told in the city. And I think we can connect that to some contemporary things. Revolutionary dreams was, I don't know, it was a term that I had just like kind of thought up. And I was like, has anybody actually used this term, to talk about their research or their pedagogy? Lo and behold, Nikki Giovanni has a poem called Revolutionary Dreams that I didn't even know about until I was preparing for this lecture. I am not Nikki Giovanni. I'm not even a poet, but I wanted to read it in full to you all just to think about, especially if we think about like what does it mean to be a part of a revolution or be revolutionary. And so the poem goes, I used to dream militant dreams of taking over America to show these white folks how it should be done. I used to dream radical dreams of blowing everyone away with my perceptive powers of correct analysis. I even used to think I'd be the one to stop the riot and negotiate the peace. Then I awoke and dug that if I dreamed natural dreams of being a natural woman, doing what a woman does when she's natural, I would have a revolution. So thank you for your time and for listening to me on what's this, Thursday? On a Thursday evening, from wherever you are in the world.
It is a Thursday evening in the world. Amber, thank you so much. This was amazing. And I really especially want to thank you for highlighting the work of your students. We are a teaching library, first and foremost. We exist for educational outreach, for working with K through 12 students and college students and lifelong learners. So, like, highlighting this work as collective work to be inspired generationally is like deeply meaningful to me and to us and to what we do. And I couldn't think of a better way to kick off this series. I'm gonna invite people because we are in webinar fashion. If you want to throw a couple of questions in the chat, we have a few minutes to take some. And as you formulate those and put them in the chat, Amber, I have a question for you. And thinking, you know, I thought long and hard about whether or not we would do an America 250 exhibit. We settled on memory as a way to really reckon with how are people remaking and remaking and remaking these narratives. What do you take from what the ABC was doing forward into the work that you're doing? Like, what's the real lesson there for us in terms of this visibility of history?
Thank you so much for that. And also, I got former students on the call. I'm like, hey, I see you, Julia. I see you, Jose. Hey, y'all. Hey. So one thing they pushed back. They were like, when folks at the Park Service were, trying to say, what does this have to do with the revolution? We're looking at the life of someone who lived in 1950. We're looking at the life of someone who lived in the 1920s. We're looking at the life of someone who lived in the 1860s. What does it have to do with the revolution? Um, and so that even that simple framework of are we celebrating a moment in time that is truncated right here? Are we celebrating, not even celebrating, because that's a whole other conversation. Are we commemorating the whole story and thinking about who we are right now and understanding, again, with that continuing revolution, that there's still work to do. Like that was part of their framework. And I was like, yes, so I can do that because that was one of the first questions that my students had too. I'm like, yeah, we're doing 250 years of history. So like anywhere in this timeline that you want to start your narrative and your investigation is a-okay because this is the timeline that we're looking at. And some of them did start in the 1700s. Literally we had 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. Yeah. So that was one thing. They ABC also pushed back, and this is a continuous struggle against the notion, some of the preservation standards, um, which were about the tangible, what do you have physically on this site? Because if you only have a ruin, then we can't tell the story. And they push back on that really hard because of, the material deprivation of some of the places that we're talking about. The George Washington Carver birthplace is partial reconstruction. Um, and so this notion of physical integrity, they were like, okay, it's not there. We can actually rebuild it. And for me as a preservationist, I'm like, oh, y'all talking about full reconstruction? Yes, they were. And they're like, well, if it's not a full reconstruction, then what programming are you going to do? And that was something that we came across in my Philly class because so many of the sites that my students had researched didn't exist anymore. And they're being trained in a school of design that is very architecturally focused. And they were like, Professor Wiley, I don't know what to propose. What am I supposed to do if the thing isn't there? I'm like, welcome to my life. Yeah, be creative. And that's what they did. And it's something that a lot of people might not call preservation, but they were still telling stories and thinking of really creative ways to continue legacies. Um, yeah, so like those are things that I take from the ABC for sure.
So we've got some questions popping up. I'm going to summarize a couple of them because they're leading in a similar direction, and a lot of just deep gratitude from some of your students in the audience and people listening for your passion. There's some questions around the erasure of Black history and some of the things that we are seeing right now, but
Mm.
there's also questions looking at from Julia to what changes do you hope to see in terms of how Black history is approached at National Park Services sites and in museums? Are there some that you think need NPS distinction now? But I think the question for a lot of people here that Julia's asking at the end, how can we as museum professionals hold institutions accountable for neglecting or sugarcoating history? Like, how do we ensure these stories are told and combat the erasure?
Man, it's hard.
Yeah, it
It is.
is. It is hard.
It's really hard. I was even, if we're being honest, I know we're being recorded, and that's fine that we're being recorded. I was scared today. I was like, oh Lord, I don't know if I can say this. Um, I used to think that my field was like a rusty, dusty field. I liked it. That was fine by me, but it was like rusty, dusty, and only certain super nerds were really into it. But then over the last 10 years, especially, yes, last 10 years, I'm I think it's coming becoming very clear to me just how important the work is. Um, and so I feel I love being an academic, and I feel like part of it is making sure that other people understand how important the work is. So, like, yeah, so much of this is related to what I do in the classroom. And so, when you're thinking about your fight, like, how do I fight? You don't always, I'm gonna say it, you don't always have to be out in the streets. You could be in the classroom. You could be doing your research. You could be working with certain partners. One thing that grew out of the Philly work is that SPA, the Society to Preserve Philadelphia's African American Assets, SPA. Um, approached us, a woman named Deborah Gary, approached the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites, to partner with them to apply for a grant from the Philly 250 Fund, which was like private investors coming together to put money towards 2026 because the city wasn't giving no money, barely. Um, we helped them write the grant. We helped them write the grant. Um, Penn is Penn got the grant, which is another one of those like funky things. Penn got the grant because the funders were like, "Can we trust you, volunteer organization, to properly handle these funds?" But they're doing the work. So there's an initiative right now called the North Philly Black History JAWN, JAWN. Um, no, hold on. North Philly Black Freedom John. That's what it is, where they are training young people to interview their elders and tell the story. So NPBFJ, I'm going to put it in the chat because I North Philly Black Freedom. So I'm not there now, right? Um, but I'm just watching from afar and I'm like, love it, because we do grant work, teaming up with folks who really are the underdogs and who are not, I don't know, the funders don't really want to fund. Um, yeah, there are so many ways. And they're the things that people are never going to hear about, but those are the different, in the classroom, who you're partnering with, um, acting as in the place of someone else. If you have privilege and access, how can you channel that over to somebody else who wants to do good work but doesn't have that same privilege and access? Like those are different ways for sure that I can think of.
Thank you so much. We have a couple questions about the ABC. Um, can you talk a little bit about whether or not Black women were represented and part of the ABC, and people who want to learn more about the ABC, like where can they read more about it?
Oh man, there isn't actually a lot of
Mm.
research that was what I'm supposed to be doing. So there are a couple of newspaper articles. Um, there is a book about public history in the 1970s. The name I'm forgetting right now, MJ Ralowska, I want to say, is like public history in the 1970s. She talks about ABC a little bit. I talk about them a little bit in my model schools in the Model City book. Um, but actually, the Park Service was trying to sit down and identify some folks to do oral histories with because they really need to do those oral histories. Um, I know that there's funding issues around that, so that's a whole other conversation. There were Marsha Greenlee is one woman who I also believe is still with us. I haven't had an opportunity to reach out to her, who was getting her master's or her doctorate at Howard and wrote a lot of the thank you very much. Thank you very much. We've got the author put here in the chat right there. Thank you. Um, for public history in the 1970s. Marsha Greenlee wrote a lot of those nominations for the National Historic Landmarks, and she has a master's thesis where she is criticizing the format of the nomination itself. Separating social history from architectural history and the various things that the Park Service is Park Service biases, I should say, bias towards this, bias towards that. So absolutely, she was doing a lot of the actual research as a student hired on the contract. Um, Lynn Gomez is another name that I saw on the nominations themselves. So it's kind of hard to find, like the two brothers were out there in the front, but there were definitely women doing the work, and they tapped a lot of women historians. Mary Frances Berry, they tapped Dorothy Porter at Moreland Spingarn at Howard. So yeah, they did the librarians and historians. A list of their board members is crazy because it includes Walter Fauntroy and Senator Edward Brooke. It was bipartisan. They had a bipartisan coalition. Um, yeah, but it's always harder to find the women in the story, but they're there and they're usually doing a lot of work.
I put that the art one of the articles you shared in the chat from the 1972 NPS with the Black Mount Rushmore on it for people to look for
Yes.
too for more of it. Jose has a bit of a deep question for you because he does that and wants to know a little bit about you talked about an elder in DC committing to research as a means to learn about self. What have you learned about yourself and your way of being in the world from this kind of work, from your work?
When I was getting my education with, a BA in architecture and master's in architectural history, then I had to scoot over to American Studies to get like more grounding and context. I wasn't really exposed to a lot of Black feminist writers. I wasn't really exposed to the notion of even like looking at our literary giants like Octavia Butler or folks like that as inspiration for how I approach and analyze space, place, and time. And now I am doing so much more of that. And things just make so much sense to me. Like even that's what like even that's why I threw Nikki Giovanni in at the end. I'm like, look, she's talking about revolutionary dreams right there. And she's giving us a way to approach our thinking about being revolutionary. Sometimes it's just being yourself. Oh, you don't actually have to do all these other things. Um, obviously people love to spout off Audre Lorde quotes these days and things like that. But I definitely find a lot more inspiration in Black feminist writing um, that I feel like really makes me a better historian and preservationist, like smarter in general. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm going to close us out with Carl's question because he asks if you can say something about your work in Oklahoma and the Institute for Quality Communities and what you're doing there
Yeah.
and what it's all about.
Yes. Well, the Institute for Quality Communities is the community engagement arm of the College of Architecture at the University of Oklahoma. So I'm from Oklahoma originally. I should say that. I've been all up and down the East Coast, all over the place, but I returned home in 2024 after being gone for 25 years. It's really an honor and a privilege to work there. It was founded in 2008 to address the severe need of primarily rural communities in Oklahoma, but small towns as well, to design services. And again, since Jose's on the call, I some of the what they were looking at in terms of inspiration is formerly the Tulane City Center, now the Albert and Tina Small Center for Design. They were, like, how can we serve the state? It was an initiative of the former OU president, David Boren, who had also been a governor. And there was also, since it's 2008, we're approaching our 20th anniversary. I've been thinking about it historically. I'm like, we were in the heart of the recession. And he was like, we need help. And so primarily we take on projects. We have an RFP opening in 3 days. Projects from communities, chambers of commerce, nonprofits that say, we have this space and we want to create something. We want to make it more efficient. We have a downtown that needs beautification. We want to improve the walkability of our streets and we don't have sidewalks and we need someone to do a walkability audit. We have a wide range of issues that people apply for our assistance um, with. And so we do the RFP, we get in applications. We as a clearinghouse to various folks. So the College of Architecture has construction science, interior design, landscape architecture, planning, architecture, and environmental design. We have a lot of different ways of working in the college. And so I present the different projects and proposals to my colleagues. They often incorporate them into their classes. If someone's teaching a transportation class, they can do a safe street plan for this small town in Westville by using their students to go and do some of the work. And they, have engagements, listen to community needs, and produce recommendations. And so we do a lot of that filling in the gap. I just had students do a presentation for a town called Poto, Poteau, Poto in LaFleur County. That was about the connectivity of their main street. That well, they used to have a main street organization, they don't anymore. And connectivity, beautification, safety, parking, all these things. Um, and someone from the town asked after the presentation, okay, so can you give us like a, a financial analysis? How much would this cost? I'm like, this is the first step. We're not going to do that work. Well, we're going to do the work where you can apply for a grant to say we want to hire somebody to think about some of these suggestions and calculate that out for us. So we do a lot of the work that helps people apply for grants. And if they're planning grants, if they're capital improvement grants, we are like that step in between. And since we're looking at our 20-year anniversary, I've been trying to figure out what the impact of the various projects have been in communities across the state. I can say a lot of things have been built. It wasn't just because we were involved, but we were a part of that process. And it's really fulfilling. And the need is there. So last year was my first year there, and we got 21 applications for projects, and 20 of them were viable. And they all had, like, it was all need, they needed assistance. So we do what we call community assistance projects. And then we also have a conference every other year called the Placemaking Conference, where we bring folks together to hear about best practices. And yeah, so that's what I told you earlier. That like we stay busy. We, had a presentation yesterday. We have an engagement in one of Oklahoma historic all black towns that has a 1930s schoolhouse that looks like it's WPA, but we don't think it's WPA, but it could be. We don't like and they want to retrofit it and turn it into a tourist destination. So we're going out to Grayson, Oklahoma, formerly called a Wildcat, to do some engagement with the folks in the town and try to figure out what it is that you really want. What do you see? And then bring case studies to them. So here are different ways that people have approached adaptive reuse and so on and so forth. So it's it's a lot of work, but it can be a lot of fun too.
And it makes a big difference, you can tell, in the way people think about things. Amber, I think I speak for everyone on the call, with just the deepest gratitude for sharing your time and your knowledge and your wisdom with us. Selfishly, I can't think of any better way to have kicked off this lecture series for us, and getting us to think about what it means to be revolutionary in
Mm,
2026 and all the different ways in which we can engage in this work and to
mhm.
keep doing the work and to keep moving forward. So thank you so much. There's some beautiful comments in the chat for you. We're going to say good night to everybody from Portland. Good night to everyone everywhere that you are, from far Caribbean islands to to Oklahoma and everywhere in between. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, everybody. And we will catch you at our next lecture, which is March 5th in person in Portland, with Richard
Mm.
Bell talking about his new book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. So we're going to
Oh,
go in a little bit of a different direction. So thanks, everybody. We will post the recording of the lecture on our Osher Map Library YouTube site very soon. And then everyone can share it so other people can appreciate it too. Thank you.
awesome. Take care,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.